Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 3 of the Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm your moderator, Brittany Miller, and I'm the Energy and Environment Reporter for the Gazette. This session is called Planning for the Grid of the Future, and it's within the Energy and Environment track. Thank you to ITC Midwest for sponsoring the session. Our time together will include talking with our panelists and addressing audience questions at the end of our panel. So feel free to shoot us a question in the chat, and I'll get to those at the end. All of our sessions have closed captioning access, and all of our sessions are being recorded. Let's give a warm welcome to our wonderful panelists. I've tasked them with introducing themselves and their connection to the power grid. So let's start with Ian, then go Robert, then Anne, then Tony.
Hello, everyone. Sorry. Hi, I'm Ian Dobson. I'm a professor at Iowa State University, and so I teach and research in power systems.
Hi, I'm Robert Walter. I'm the manager of planning for ITC Midwest. I oversee the reliability planning for the ITC Midwest transmission system, which serves the Cedar Rapids area, as well as approximately 85% of the counties in Iowa.
Anne?
I'm Ann Kimber. I'm the director of the Iowa State University Electric Power Research Center. We're in our 60th year. We have 10 industry members, including Mid-American, Alliant, Cedar Falls, Ames, ITC Midwest, MISO, Conductix, NIPCO, Corn Belt, SIPCO.
And Tony.
Hi, my name is Tony Hunziker. I am the senior manager for our policy planning team, specializing and focusing on looking out into the future and seeing what our grid may look like.
And you're with MISO.
Yeah, I'm with MISO. Sorry.
Okay, I don't know if you said that. Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here to chat about our energy. Today, we'll be talking about the past, present, and future of our power grid and what role renewable energy has in it. Let's start off with the basics. What does today's power grid look like, and how did it evolve to this point? Whoever wants to start with that.
I can go ahead and start at least. The ITC Midwest system, our system's made up of the system that was formerly owned by Alliant Energy, which was, pieced together as 3 different utility companies in the state of Iowa merged over time. A lot of what that system looked like originally when it was built, there was a lot of small generating plants in each individual community. As the system started to get built out over time, they built lines between those communities to be able to utilize that as backup. And then, in the 70s and 80s, they went to large central station generating units, right? So the big coal plants that you see along the Mississippi and Missouri River in Iowa, that was kind of the transition at that point in time to those large central station units. And from that point, there was transmission that was built out to get the power from those units that were really reliable and predictable to the load centers. And as you see today, now we're starting to see those coal plants retire, and you're seeing those replaced with renewables that are dispersed across the state, not necessarily in those load centers, but also not along those Mississippi and Missouri River areas. So they're in different locations than we've traditionally seen generation. And the output is not as predictable as those coal plants were.
Gotcha. Can we, just to clarify, can you trace, how energy starts at generators and then gets to our homes and businesses? Just kind of trace that path for us.
Well, you start with your generators, as Robert mentioned, and then you usually step up the voltages and transmit it around the state and the nation, and then it's stepped down at lower voltages, and then it comes to homes and businesses. So there's really sort of 2 parts to the system. There's a transmission system, which is the high voltage stuff, well over 30,000 volts. And that's like your interstate highway system. And then there's the more your local roads, which take the supply points in the high voltage system, and then step it down with transformers to get to the wires that come to your house and to your business. So it goes from generation up into the system and then down again, and we're connected to everything else east of the Rockies too. So it's a big regional thing, and the point of the exercise is to keep the lights on.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, and Tony, this might be a good part for you to jump in at. What is MISO? What is Iowa's part in MISO, etc.?
Yeah, so MISO is a independent, not-for-profit, member-based organization focused on the managing the flow of high voltage electricity across 15 states in the Canadian province of Manitoba, facilitating one of the world's largest energy markets with more than 40 billion in annual transactions, and then planning the grid of the future. Our footprint basically stretches from the Canadian border down to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Dakotas out to the Indiana-Ohio border, and it kind of gets into an hourglass shape in the kind of the Iowa, Missouri region, and then kind of funnels back out for the southern region.
Gotcha. And how has the variety of energy generation sources in MISO and in Iowa changed over time?
Yeah, so I think Robert, kind of teed it up for us that, here in the Midwest, we were predominantly coal, just due to proximity to a lot of the coal out in kind of the Dakotas and Wyoming kind of area. From a MISO perspective, in 2005, 65% of our energy was served by coal and 17% was by natural gas. In 2022, 30% of our energy was served by coal and 36% of our energy was natural gas and 12% was by wind. We're currently, we've just completed updating our future planning scenarios, and looking out to 2042, we're seeing that coal could be in the range of 0 to 4% of serving energy. Gas could be anywhere from 1 to 16%, and then you're going to have a lot of wind, solar, and batteries making up the majority of that energy production.
Mm-hmm. And any of the other experts, can you comment on, how generation in Iowa, what we're looking at right now?
Yeah, I mean, I can go ahead and jump in. So, the numbers Tony quoted for MISO, they're very similar to, at least to the generation on the ITC Midwest system. I mean, I think looking at 2010, we were around 70% coal for the megawatt hours for the energy generated on the ITC Midwest system. And now we're in that 30% range for coal. Gas has moved up, similar to MISO, where it was 15%, and now it's roughly 30%. And then renewables, especially wind, has kind of filled in that gap for where you see those changes in the system. So at least the ITC Midwest system follows closely with those numbers Tony quoted for MISO as a whole.
And I'd just like to add that another interesting thing about Iowa and also the Midwest is that there's a mix of different kinds of utilities, different ownership models for utilities. So Mid-American and Alliant are big investor-owned utilities. And then you have rural electric cooperatives that are consumer-owned. And those serve a large part of the rural areas of Iowa. And you also have city-owned utilities that are owned and governed by municipal boards and councils. And they each are making their own investment decisions about different energy portfolios. And I think of all the utilities I can think of, every one of them has some kind of portfolio of wind plus solar plus battery. So all these utilities, as they're changing their planning for their future, are actively adding renewable energy and storage on their systems.
Yeah, we've talked about, how the use of coal is decreasing and, renewables is increasing. How has that impacted our power grid and reliability and things like that?
Well, the problem the problem with wind and solar is that wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine at night, you know. And that is a huge that represents huge uncertainty for the planners of these systems. And so I think when you and I were talking, Brittany, I was saying that we all needed to find an electrical engineer to hug, because planning for a system that has all these variable resources becomes a bit of a challenge. I think it's one that the engineers are up to, but it's not a small thing at all. When wind speeds are variable, there can be weird weather events where the wind suddenly drops and a massive amount of wind falls off the system. But there's so much wind across a large part of the nation now that it is starting to act like almost like what we would call a baseload resource, because the wind is blowing somewhere at all times. So if you have a transmission system that's robust, then you can deliver that wind somewhere. So it's all changing. We're learning to deal with weather forecasting. We're all becoming better forecasters than we used to be because we have to. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
just building on what Anne was saying, I mean, it's kind of shifting from a capacity mindset to energy mindset, and making sure that every hour of the day, the year, has enough, resources to provide. Taking account the intermittency of wind and solar, and either making sure that you have enough of it spread out across a wide geographical area, or other types of sources that complement it, like batteries, other types of storage, and other future technologies that are emerging.
Mhm. Robert, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, up until recently, a lot of what we were seeing for transmission upgrades was, making it the ability to get the generation connected and on the system. And a lot of now what we're going to is, like you said, Ian said, the wind is intermittent. Well, we had that generation, the coal and some of that other generation there that could fill in the gaps when the wind stopped blowing. Well, now as that's being retired, the transmission upgrades are going from getting the stuff, the renewables connected, to being able to actually move them around, like Ann said, to the place where the wind is blowing to where the power is needed. So it's kind of a paradigm shift in that regard, where it's not so as much getting the ability to get it connected. Now it's the ability to move the large amounts of power around to where it's available, to where it's needed.
Mhm. What's the progress with that in, our in MISO and, our area of the Midwest?
Yeah, so in MISO, we've embarked on this reliability imperative, which is the shared responsibility between MISO, our states, and our members and regulators of ensuring that the grid is reliable, sustainable, and efficient. One part of that reliability imperative is the long range transmission plan, which last year, so the long range transmission planning is a effort that's divided up in 4 different phases, looking at 20 years out into the future and trying to accommodate the various different resource mixes and policies that folks within the MISO footprint may have. Last year, we completed the first phase, or tranche 1, which resulted in roughly $10.1 billion of new transmission investment for the Midwest area. And then right now, we're currently working on tranche 2. So kind of refreshing the look and the policy goals, the economics, getting all the new legislation, tax incentives, and et cetera.
And that tranche will also be in the Midwest, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Gotcha. I want to toss it over to Ian. You and I had spoken about, the threat of increasingly extreme weather events on the power grid. Can you speak to that and how, that's impacting the grid?
Yeah, well, to keep the lights on, I mean, the utilities and the entire industry is very much focused on reliability. The average performance, the number of customer minutes out. It's very sensitive to the times when people lose power, and there's great efforts to keep the reliability up. Resilience is a little bit different because you're looking at the much more extreme events. And you can have reliability under normal circumstances just by having more than enough generation available, because you have to have more than you need at any one time in order to have the flexibility, and you need the transmission to be able to move it around, transmission capacity to be able to move it around. So that's reliability, and there's a big focus on that. But we can't build the system strong enough with reasonable cost when there's very extreme weather, and that's the resilience problem. Like when the derecho came through central Iowa, it knocked down a lot of the power system, both transmission and distribution. And it's hard to see. Everything is done to try and keep costs down. I mean, one of the great things about wind power and solar is that they're cheap, and we can keep the rates that everyone pays down, have cheaper electricity, while still trying to make it sustainable and reliable. But when you get very extreme winds, then we have to go to our stakeholders and say, well, how do we go about doing this if it only occurs rarely, but we know it's going to happen again? Because with climate change and so on, it will slowly be more events and more extreme events. Slowly, but we are going to have other events. And so it's a big public concern. And of course, the industry is very concerned to invest sensibly in hardening where necessary, operating more carefully when there's weather forecasts are bad, and also being able to repair quickly to get things back up and running. But it's that all costs money. And so it's also a public policy question. How do we prepare our state for extreme events?
Yeah, I want to get to the money question in a second. I'm curious if the other members of the group have, thoughts on the impact of extreme weather to our grid. They want to add?
Yeah, I can just throw in. I mean, like Ian said, it's the cost. Ultimately, you're trying to keep the costs, reasonable for who's paying the bill at the end of the day. So it's making sure, as we do replacements due to aging infrastructure, that kind of thing, we're replacing it with, the modern standards to help with that ability. So when you go to do replacements, you use the modern construction standards that are, obviously there's the extreme weather that you can't build for everything, but as construction standards have come along, the stuff we build to today is more better to withstand that extreme weather than construction standards of the 1950s and 60s. Some of the stuff we're replacing when that was built. But the other thing with resilience, we have a set reliability criteria we have to plan to, but there's consideration now of resilience and how does that come into play in planning, and having alternate paths which may not be needed for that reliability criteria, but they could help with the resilience, having multiple paths in and out of an area to provide that, and even thinking, normally in the planning world, we don't really think about how you run lines, right? It's, I need to get from A to B, but even considering, do you have a bunch of north-south lines going into an area? Should you actually make one run east-west for those kind of extreme weather events like the derecho, so that line would not be susceptible to those strong straight line winds? That kind of thing is now coming into play as well.
I'd like to add just a little bit, and this is because we have at Iowa State a FEMA building resilience and communities scoping grant to look at community resilience. So you're talking to ITC transmission planner and MISO, who organizes all the transmission planners, and Ian, who studies resilience. But the communities have a role to play in resilience planning too. And one of the things that is kind of interesting to look at from the other end of that is how communities figure out what the critical loads are they might need to serve during a disaster. Like Is it the community shelter? Is it the local grocery store? Is it the gas station? So there's a whole other set of resilience infrastructures that could be thought about as well from a distribution perspective. So that's an interesting project.
Mhm. So, did you have anything to add?
Other than, through the MISO footprint, we have seen a uptick in severe extreme weather events since the early 2010s, with such storms like Uri, Elliott, the Iowa derecho. So, I mean, it's definitely something that we're seeing. It's had a heavy impact with our operations and our markets, and trying to uh, get more of that look embedded in our transmission planning efforts.
Mhm. I promised I'd get back to the money question. So, obviously, resiliency and reliability, maintaining that costs money. Who should shoulder the cost of upgrading the power grid?
Ouch.
Yeah.
That's a hard question. It's like the greatest benefit for the most number of people. How is that defined? Who regulates those costs and does kind of independent auditing of the value of those investments? Those are really hard questions to answer. It's so I'm kind of not answering your question directly, but in my FEMA project, we use a FEMA benefit cost analysis as to determine the value of a project, which I think is different from how ITC or MISO or the utilities might place a value. So in the FEMA framework, it's about the value of human lives, or the value of the lost food, or the value of the lost jobs because the disaster happened. So if you think about certain communities who are out for a long time, the value of resilience investments for those communities in the FEMA world might be quite high. It's a question of who's going to pay for those investments as well. So if FEMA pays, that's different than it has to satisfy those FEMA criteria. So it's a hard question you asked, Brittany.
I can throw in, so ITC Midwest is a member, we're a transmission owning member of MISO. So we follow the MISO rules as far as the costs go. But generally, in MISO, it's, who benefits from the project is who ultimately pays, right? And so there's kind of two buckets, I guess, the big buckets in MISO. We have the local projects, which are generally developed by ITC Midwest or whoever the transmission owner is, to meet the local needs. Now, local needs on our system, it is pretty broadly defined because, like I said, our footprint covers 85% of the counties in Iowa. We also go into southern Minnesota and cover a little bit in Illinois. So, I mean, our footprint is large, but that's local from that MISO perspective, is within our footprint. And then, like Tony talked about, the long range transmission plan projects, those are the regional projects. And so, MISO has the heavy lift of determining that, everyone benefits from those. And if they make that determination, then those costs get shared across the entire MISO footprint.
So there's two ways. In your electricity bill, some of that goes towards reliability and resilience, so that you get much more certainty that the lights will be on. And the other way is through your taxes. It could come through FEMA, especially for resilience when a disaster is declared. But then it is a complicated process. Utilities are very highly regulated, and they work within that framework whenever they increase their rates.
And I guess one thing, Ian mentioned taxes. So there is, with the IIJA funding out there is some resilience grants from the DOE. Obviously, that's going to be funded by taxpayer dollars, but there is a way for utilities to apply for some of those federal dollars to help offset the cost of the resilience project. So they would be more localized still, but there is that opportunity out there for transmission owners or other utilities to seek some of that DOE money to seek some of those resilience projects and ultimately use the taxpayer dollars to help offset the cost to their local customers.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I mean-
and I'll just add that, you know, it's probably not just a one cost allocation paradigm that you're looking at. It's going to be dependent on the types of projects that you're looking at and evaluating. You know, just connecting a new generator could look one way. Doing some of the local reliability projects could look another way. But then doing, you know, large regional backbone transmission could look quite a lot different. And you know, along with that is, you know, different benefits. And so looking at, you know, the long range transmission planning, we're bringing in multiple benefits other than just the economic and reliability perspective.
Mhm. I wanna talk about some cool things that are happening in the energy space. What are some of the newer innovations that y'all are seeing? I want to start with Anne and talk about your agrivoltaics project that you're working on.
Okay, well, this is really a fun one. And our ribbon cutting is next week, so we're super excited. So Alliant is building a 1.35 megawatt solar array south of the Iowa State campus. And if you drive by the Ag 450 farm, you'll see it right across the street from there. So what's really interesting about that customer hosted solar array is that there are 4 different technologies, 2 fixed arrays at different heights and 2 single axis tracking arrays at different heights, all powered by 1 motor, I should mention. And we're going to be growing fruits and vegetables under those arrays. So come next summer, all of you can come over and we can sell you these strawberries and summer squash and peppers, and I have forgotten the other crops. But we're going to be doing our first planting and harvesting next summer. So the whole purpose of a project like that is to bring together the great experience of the horticulturists at Iowa State and Iowa State Extension with the power engineering folks and Alliant, who's building other customer hosted solar arrays around the Midwest, to see how we can make agrivoltaics, this idea of multiple values from a single project, work so that there can be community benefits from solar arrays because of the production of local fruits and vegetables. So we're doing, this is a research project. We're not advocating for any one thing, but we really want to know, can we make this work? Is there a positive or a negative impact on power production? We kind of think that it's going to be like no impact at all to maybe a slight positive effect. And there may even be a positive effect on the vegetables because there might be a little bit of shading and the most hot summer weather. So that's a really innovative project. We're really proud that we got a grant from the Department of Energy for $1.8 million to actually carry out this research. But to me, the biggest, most exciting part about this is that we're bringing very different kinds of people together to study the impacts of power systems on something. So, you know, we have our electrical engineers talking to our fruits and vegetables specialists. Like that doesn't happen very often, you know. We're talking about strawberries. They're learning about solar production. We're both benefiting from this. And it's going to be very publicly visible with lots of public outreach. So a lot of people will be able to get to come to see this, learn about PV production, and learn about vegetable and fruit production. So I think that'll be a really fun and kind of edgy project because we're all having to learn everybody else's language. So that's one. I also wanted to mention, since I didn't mention it earlier, you know, we're talking about planning for uncertain generation because we have wind and solar. We also have uncertain loads. There's this huge unknown of electrification impacts. Like how many people are going to be driving electric cars in 2025? How many people will be driving electric cars in 2030? And how many people will have switched from their old gas furnaces to heat pumps? We're looking at a massive, massive shift in what we're expecting from the grid. And if that doesn't keep you up at night, I don't know what will, because it's like everything is changing all at once. So we need cool projects, and we're getting cool projects, and it's a good thing. So,
Yeah, just building on what Anne was saying, uh, you know, load, there is uncertainty around load, and there's uncertainty around the resource fleet. And at least from a MISO perspective, we leverage a portfolio of future scenarios to test our various different transmission ideas on. So, I mentioned before our Tranche 1 portfolio that got approved. That was evaluated on a future that fairly closely represents members' plans and state goals, and has like a modest amount of electric vehicle growth. But then our other futures start ratcheting up exactly what Ann was saying, that electrification. And it's not just electric vehicles. I mean, it's electrifying stuff in your house, like your water heater. But then even the bigger impacts are going to be in your commercial and industrial processing as well. And so the Tranche 2 effort that's currently underway is looking at a future that has elevated amounts of electrification in it. And we're just wrapping up what the resource fleet is going to be looking at. And the reliability and economic models have recently just been posted out there for review. So folks are interested, it's good time to get involved and follow along, and as we continue through the analysis phase.
cool.
Yeah, and I was going to throw out there, one other thing we're seeing in Iowa specifically is a lot of interest in hydrogen production, right? We've been getting a lot of inquiries at ITC Midwest about, siting potential hydrogen production facilities and connecting to the transmission system. So that's one thing. It talks about electrification. That's a big electrification impact, because it's pretty energy intensive to take water and turn it into hydrogen. So we're seeing those increases. I think there's a lot of draw to the area with like the amount of wind we have. They want to make this what's called green hydrogen, right? So they're using that renewable generated electricity to turn that water into hydrogen. So there's been a lot of interest in that. And I think it seems like it's going to keep going at this point.
Mhm.
Yeah, one thing is that traditionally the utilities have just followed the load. So if you switch on any electric appliance in your house, the utility supplies that extra power, and it's all balanced out very carefully with many control systems and so on. But now perhaps we can also think about having flexibility on the load side. Something as simple as, you run your dishwasher at night when the power is cheaper. You see, because when you build the power grid, you have to build it for the maximum use of it, not the average use of it, so that everything stays safe. And so with the variability in the generation, perhaps it will be also cost effective to have some flexibility in the loads as well, because in a way you're producing negative watts. You produce positive watts of energy at the of power at the generation, but if you delay using an electrical appliance, for example, or charge your car not when everyone else wants to do it at 5:30 p.m., then you're making better use of the system, and you could get cheaper power, and it'll be could be a more reliable system. But this is a huge change, as Anne has mentioned, and electricity, as you know, when it goes off, is central to all the other infrastructures we have. You can't even pump gas, and if you wait 8 hours, the cell phone towers batteries go dead. and so on and so forth. So you lose all these other infrastructures. So concentrating on getting a better, smarter grid that rises to this challenge of more variability while keeping the price of electricity cheap and reliable is a huge challenge, because we're changing society to make everything sustainable, because we know we can't continue burning stuff, because that will gradually heat the planet and make things increasingly but slowly unlivable. So we've got to do this, and the electricity grid is really an integral part of this. But it's not just doing it for climate change; it's doing it for cleaner air, cheaper electricity, and a better way of life. I think there is a big challenge.
I can see why this keeps some people up at night.
Yeah.
I want to jump off something that Tony had mentioned about how, people can get involved in these decisions. As the power grid continues to grow and evolve, how do you think customers can get involved? How can you ensure good relationships with landowners on projects? Anyone can take it away.
I'll start. I mean, I think the starting point is humility, actually, and making sure that people understand just what is involved. We've grown up, I think all of us, with the ability to just to flip on a switch and the lights appear. We don't have any. I never have had, until maybe the last 10 years, a real understanding of just how incredibly complicated this machine is that's producing power, like 10 to the -9 seconds before it actually appears in your light bulb, or it may be a shorter period of time before that. So I think humility, making sure that people know what's at stake, like good education for people to understand how these different forms of generation work, and what their role, what the consumer's role is in the power system. Like, we haven't asked people to really become, experts at electromagnetics, and they shouldn't have to if they don't want to. But people's choices do matter. People's participation does matter. And if we're going to solve these problems that we're now facing, we really do need everyone involved. So, the transmission grid, some people like myself, I think the transmission towers are beautiful and amazing technology. And just, I like to drive around and look at transmission. Not everyone is like that. But the ability of the transmission grid to balance out large amounts of renewable generation coming from sources to very urban loads where you could never build such renewable generation, it's a huge feat. It's a huge accomplishment, but it may not mean anything to the people who have to look at those towers every day. So I think that we have to do our jobs. The people at Iowa State and all that stuff have to do our job of making sure that we're available to the public, and we can provide them information so that they understand how these decisions, how these choices affect their communities. And then I think from the community resilience point of view that I mentioned, just what is the critical load? What's the thing I really need to power in my community? How does my community work? What do we want to do for our own planning so that we now participate in that way as well? I think that's one way to get people involved.
I think the people's involvement is very important, but I'd also like to mention that Iowa is innovating. Iowa is second in the nation in wind power, behind Texas, and Texas, of course, is a much bigger state than Iowa. And that's one reason businesses want to come here and establish here and provide jobs, and also it's about how, as a state, we make our living. if we are very favorable for wind power, and if we can generate all wind power and solar power and ship it outside the state, you know, when the power flows one way, the money flows back into Iowa. And this is part of the state making its money out of energy. It already is an energy producing state with ethanol, but it can also makes money from wind energy. And so I just wanted to say that although this is indeed a big challenge, Iowa is an innovative place that's friendly to businesses making money and providing jobs. And I think there's a good possibility that we can do this and even be one of the leaders in transforming things.
Yeah, I just add that, you know, and kind of that goal of having Iowa be a energy exporting state, you know, that's going to require a lot of broad regional transmission to help make that work. And so it's going to be collaboration and engagement with everyone to garner that broad support. It's not a done deal right now. So it's working with everybody, trying to get as best of a business justification as we can, bring in our state regulators along. So, you know, when after we approve lines, you know, our members such as ITC, Alliant, and Mid-American, you know, they can work towards getting those built and, you know, not running into a you know, a lot of opposition there. So just trying to get that broad support kind of at the beginning.
Yeah, and I guess one thing to drive it home, you know, ITC Midwest, you know, siting infrastructure and building infrastructure in Iowa, you know, we have pretty specific rules we have to follow that the Iowa Utilities Board set for those things. So, I mean, that's, you know, ultimately that's landowners get involved through that Iowa Utilities Board process for us when we're siting this infrastructure. You know, we're going to them, asking them for an easement on their property and letting them know we're going to be, you know, proposing to build a line through there and getting their feedback in that process of citing that ultimately where we're going to put those poles, those beautiful poles, as Ann called them, that people can look at. So that's, you know, a big part of the process for ITC Midwest building that infrastructure is working that Iowa Utilities Board defined process and citing and getting those landowner buy-ins that way.
Mhm.
If you think about it, analogous to the interstate highway system, you can see how much value Iowa citizens and Iowa businesses have with having a maintained and upgraded interstate highway system. The same thing applies to having the high voltage transmission grid to be able to ship power out of Iowa and through Iowa and around Iowa, and that's part of what gives us cheap and reliable electricity.
I'd love to turn it over to some audience questions. We have quite a bit that came through. So audience members, if you have more, send them in our chat and we'll try to get to them. So the first question asks, to what extent is battery storage part of the new grid system, and how reliable is it?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, battery is a critically important part of the resource fleet going forward. It's not without its own challenges or kind of uniqueness because, you know, as Ian was talking about from a load perspective, you know, moving usage to a different time could be seen as a negative load modifier. Well, kind of with storage, you need to charge that battery. And so that becomes a load increase to that. And so the whole idea of trying to find and optimize the best times to charge and discharge those batteries, and then how to elongate that potential charge that they have. Because like today with lithium ion batteries, it's basically 4 hours. Well, how do you get that to 8 hours or 12 hours or uh, a week or like across a season?
I think on the distribution side, maybe even behind the meter side, there is interest in maybe smaller scale battery deployments, homeowners, small businesses, emergency managers, using batteries instead of a diesel generator might become really feasible for certain kinds of loads and certain kinds of disaster response. So there's scaling, there's batteries on the transmission system, big batteries, and then there's like little batteries, and we haven't talked, and we probably won't have time to talk about the potential for vehicle to grid. Now your car, you may choose in the future to let your car charge the grid and be paid for it. We're not there yet in Iowa, or maybe even in the Midwest, but that's coming. That will come. So and that's just another source of uncertainty in planning the grid. What's the value of that power for you not to be able to drive your car, but you shaved the peak and saved us all from a brownout on the worst day of the year some day in the future.
Another audience member had a similar question about nuclear power. To what extent is its role on the grid?
A lot of interest in modular nuclear power, in part because of the concern about what's called energy droughts. The wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, and your batteries just exhausted their capacity. What are you going to do if you're trying to be 100% non-fossil based? So it seems like no proper conversation about a future generation system can ignore the possibility of modular nuclear power. And there's some good research and demonstration projects being undertaken now. So it's definitely got to be part of the conversation.
And it's got to get commercialized quickly too. So I think right now it's kind of a lot of testing, and I think the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just approved their first small modular reactor design. So we'll need additional reactor designs. We'll need some of these to be built so they can show and improve their capabilities and efficiencies, and then you'll get the mass adoption with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they need to get the costs down for the and actually commercialize it as something that you can manufacture and sell at reasonable cost. And it will be important probably, but there's going to be a delay while people figure out how to do that. And we do have to move forward with the other solutions as for right now. And the other thing we haven't mentioned is that there's some of the balancing can be done with gas turbines, and that is much better than coal since it has half the impact on CO2. But that's a bridging technology because we have to stop burning fossil fuels. I just wanted to mention that that's also available as we transition, because we have to think about not only where we want to go, but how do we get there and keep the lights on as we proceed. So I just wanted to mention that as well. But the economics say that the wind and solar are excellent for cheap for inexpensive power, and that they if we succeed with, and especially with organizations like MISO having wind blowing somewhere in their footprint almost all the time, we can get the power we need.
Mm-hmm. Another audience question asks about security of our energy grid. Occasionally, there are reports that our electric grid could be and has been brought down with computer code that is installed there by those who wish to do us harm. Is that true? Is that false? Was it once true, or now we're no longer vulnerable? What's up?
I mean, generally, at least for the utilities that I'm aware of, you know, the transmission grid operations is generally very isolated from the internet and the rest of the world by design for that purpose, right? I mean, they have what's called hardened areas, control rooms that have very restricted access, physical access even for those reasons, to make sure that you can't, you know, people who shouldn't be in there can't access it. I mean, there is physical security as well. You know, you've heard the news stories about large power transformers getting shot up, and I don't remember if it was in the Carolinas and up in the Pacific Northwest and California. So I mean, I know ITC and other transmission owners around the country have been, you know, improving physical security at substations for that purpose. You know, putting walls, ballistic walls around key assets, putting in no cut, no climb fences to keep people out of substations where they shouldn't be. You know, security monitoring 24/7, you know, response times if we have alarms at our substations, that kind of thing, to beef up that physical security to prevent those kind of attacks going forward. But again, it's a cost equation, right? If you make the most secure system in the world, no one will be able to afford to turn their lights on.
But the other way that I mean, those things are needed. But the other way is to have the system built robust enough, because, for example, when that substation in California was attacked by people shooting it up, there was no blackout because the system had already enough redundancy in it that power could be routed by different routes around the substation, and no customers or businesses lost power. So this is one of the side effects of all the other reasons for investing in the transmission grid, is it's more robust against attacks if there's more redundancy.
Another audience question. Utilities are having some difficulties procuring grid replacements, especially transformers. How does this impact or deny any possibility of electrifying everything?
Oh, I'd like to take a stab at that one. So they're right. There are delays. There are supply chain problems getting transformers, and the cost of transformers has increased significantly. So the distribution grid, where you know, distributed renewable resources are being built, smaller scale solar, maybe smaller scale wind, and some battery. There is some give or overbuilding of the distribution system that can accommodate some of that, but it's an area of applied research to figure out how much you can load up the existing distribution transformers where a bunch of customers in a neighborhood, for example, if Ian gets a Tesla and I live right next to Ian, I'm going to want a Tesla as well. So the rate of electrification can be kind of lumpy. You know, a neighborhood may all decide they're going to adopt things because we've all looked at each other's app and we think our heat pump water heaters are really cool and we all want one now. So in that case, you could have overloading of transformers that could become a real kind of headache for the distribution planners. One way to buy some time, frankly, for electrification and advance it is through rate design, is through basically time of use rates. So you're encouraging people, like, please don't charge your Tesla vehicle until 10 o'clock at night. Then everything will be fine. We'll be fine. So if utilities can implement time of use rates, we can improve the use of the distribution and transmission facilities that we have. And it's good for everybody. So it requires some updates to the metering, but it's a really good technological solution. One thing that we'll have to have another session about all this stuff because there's so much to talk about, but you know, at the same time that we're planning the large grid and the large pieces of generation, there are real advances in technology on the distribution side that can actually help make all of this work together. So, and one of these is as simple as just changing consumer behavior through time of use rates.
Awesome. I'm going to go to another question because we have about 6 minutes left. We have honestly a lot of questions. So One audience member asked, why have we not always been burying lines rather than putting them on poles?
It's expensive to bury lines. And it's hard to do in certain urban areas. And it's just too expensive in rural areas. You know,
And the really high voltage ones are they don't do well on underground because it heats up too much. You see, if you have an overhead line, it gets free air cooling, right? But underground, it's now you can underground the lower voltage parts, but it's just too expensive to do it all over. Yeah.
Yeah, the cost, and like Ian said, you know, the higher voltage stuff, it's more intrusive construction wise than you would think, you know, for protecting public safety and you know, making sure there's access to do maintenance and do repairs on it. I mean, typically the higher voltage lines are, you know, buried in concrete duct bank, which is a bunch of pipes covered in concrete and buried in the ground. So, you know, instead of planting a pole every, you know, several hundred feet, you're ripping a giant trench down a farm field if you're doing it in rural Iowa and burying a bunch of concrete in it. So it's a lot more intrusive construction wise than you would think. And then also the cost of that. So those are two big considerations for why, you know, burying transmission lines, especially, it doesn't make sense other than, you know, in like downtown Minneapolis or someplace like that, you know, where it's a large urban area and it's just not practical due to all the buildings to have overhead lines.
Gotcha. This might be the last question we have time for. Another audience member asked, does having a decentralized energy grid increase resilience of the grid? If so, does it make sense to pay people who overproduce a more reasonable rate for their energy to help incentivize production?
a decentralized grid can increase resilience. It's, you know, it's all going back to the whole planning problem. If you want to get massive amounts of renewables to as many places as you possibly can, the cheapest, then you're going to want a centralized transmission, robust, high voltage DC transmission system that can move a lot of renewable energy to a lot of urban areas. Having said that, there's a value to having decentralized local distribution grids. As far as what people should get paid for the energy they produce, that is a complicated issue. That, you know, if you look at the cost per kilowatt hour for rooftop solar compared with the cost per kilowatt hour of utility scale solar is cheaper. It's cheaper for the whole set of consumers served by that utility. So it becomes a societal question about how to value that local solar production. And it's not one that I'm competent to answer. It's just that there are these trade-offs. It's again like designing the system that has the greatest value for the most number of people at the lowest possible cost you can do it, which is what the utilities are regulated to do. So having said that, yes, we should be doing everything all at once, basically. We should be doing the local systems for resilience and identifying the critical loads. We should be doing time of use rates. We should be building out the transmission system. We should be adding a lot of wind and solar and batteries. Just have to do it all.
That sounds like a lot of work. Does anyone else in the panel want to add anything in 1 minute or less? If not, that is cool. Well, we have reached the last minute of our panel here, so I'll start sending us off. Thank you for those in the audience who attended, and thank you again to our wonderful panelists for being here today. Our next session in the energy and environment track is about protecting ourselves from forever chemicals, or PFAS. It's moderated by my colleague, Aaron Jordan, and it starts at 2:45 p.m. I hope to see some of you there. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.